The colonel was a man whose name once carried weight across the South, a figure whose fortune was built on acres of fertile land and the unyielding labor of those forced to toil upon it. His plantation stretched as far as the eye could see, a kingdom carved from soil and sweat, a dynasty that seemed immovable, eternal. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, his manner commanding. Neighbors called him a pillar of society, a man of discipline, honor, and wealth. Behind those polished descriptions, however, lay a character as restless as it was ruthless, a man who measured worth not in virtue, but in control. The plantation itself reflected his pride. Rows of cotton spread like endless white seas under the sun, and beyond them rose the grand house, columns gleaming, windows glinting, the porch wide enough to host 100 guests. Inside, chandeliers sparkled, carpets imported from Europe softened every step, and portraits of stern ancestors stared down from gilded frames. Everything spoke of prosperity, permanence, a family that had risen above the ordinary and planted its name firmly in the annals of the nation's growing aristocracy. Yet beneath this veneer of grandeur pulsed a current of unease. The colonel ruled his estate with an iron hand, both feared and obeyed. His slaves whispered of his temper, of punishments that left scars, of commands that tolerated no hesitation. Even his overseers, hardened men accustomed to cruelty, found him relentless. He demanded perfection in the fields, precision in the household, silence in the quarters. Nothing escaped his eye, and when it did, the consequences were swift to him. Control was the essence of survival. To bend another's will was proof of his own strength. His marriage had been no exception to this philosophy. His wife, a woman of striking beauty, had been chosen as much for her grace as for the alliances her family brought. She was young when he married her, delicate in stature, her face soft with innocence. To society, they seemed the perfect pair, the powerful colonel and his refined bride. To those who knew them more intimately, the truth was less romantic. She was reserved, quiet, her laughter rare. Those who caught glimpses of her in unguarded moments noticed a weariness in her eyes, as though her soul carried a weight too great for her youth. The colonel, for all his devotion to appearances, saw her not as an equal but as another possession, another proof of his dominance. Pride was his constant companion. He relished being seen as magnanimous, as generous, yet his generosity was always laced with calculation. When he entertained guests at his great table, he made sure the wine flowed freely, the music played loud, the conversation glittered. But his true joy came not from the camaraderie, but from the knowledge that every man present envied him. His wealth, his land, his wife, everything about him declared supremacy. He was a man who could not be rivaled, and he intended for everyone to remember it. Still, pride has a way of breeding its own destruction. In the colonel's restless heart, pride often curdled into recklessness, into choices made not for necessity, but for the thrill of asserting power. He tested boundaries, sought out acts that would leave others shocked, even scandalized, as though daring the world to challenge him. And when no one dared, his hunger only grew. Control was intoxicating, but it demanded ever greater demonstrations to satisfy him. The plantation thrived, his wealth grew, his family's name rose higher, yet still he searched for new ways to remind himself, and others, that he stood above all. It was in this state of mind that the seeds of the fateful pact were planted. He saw his wife not as a partner but as a symbol, a jewel in his crown, a possession that proved his superiority. But what better way to prove his dominance than to risk even the sanctity of that possession? To him, the idea was not madness, but a test of loyalty, of control, of legacy. He had given his commands to overseers, to slaves, to servants, to neighbors, but now he contemplated a command so outrageous, so unthinkable, that it would forever mark his name in whispers. The thought grew inside him like a shadow, fed by pride and an arrogance so vast it blinded him to consequence. The colonel's pride was the foundation of his dynasty, but pride unchecked is the first step toward ruin. Though the world saw him as unshakable, within his grand house he had already begun to carve the cracks that would one day split it apart. The man who believed himself invincible had set himself on a path where every triumph of power would only hasten the destruction of all he held. And in the silence of the southern night, with cicadas singing in the fields and the grand house looming white against the darkness, the seeds of that destruction took root, waiting for the day they would bear their poisonous fruit. She had arrived at the colonel's house with all the ceremony society demanded of a marriage that bound two families of fortune and name. The carriages rolled up the long drive, the great doors opened, and she was greeted as the new mistress of a dynasty. At first, the grandeur dazzled her, the sweeping staircases, the ballrooms lit by hundreds of candles, the gardens that seemed to stretch without end. She had been raised in comfort, but this was a different kind of power, the kind that made people bow their heads and lower their voices when her husband entered a room. And yet, even in those early days, she felt the isolation settle around her shoulders like a cloak too heavy to cast off. The colonel was attentive at first in his way. He showed her the estate, the rows of cotton gleaming in the sun, the slave quarters where men and women bent under the burden of labor. He explained, with pride in his voice, the scale of his wealth, the reach of his influence. But his attentions were never gentle. They were lessons, lectures, demonstrations of control. She realized quickly that her role was not to question, not to contribute, but to reflect his glory back to him. In his eyes, she was a prized possession, an ornament of beauty meant to confirm his power. Her laughter became something he could display at parties, her silence a tool he could use at home. In the early months, she tried to play her role faithfully. She smiled at his guests, dressed in gowns chosen to impress, and sat at his side while the men talked politics and land and the future of the South. She kept her voice soft, her opinions hidden, for she knew that any misstep would bring his disapproval. But the loneliness of the house began to gnaw at her. When the guests were gone and the music had faded, she found herself wandering the endless halls, her footsteps echoing off marble floors. The house was filled with people, maids, cooks, footmen, slaves whose lives were devoted to serving. But she had no one she could call friend. She watched the women in the fields sometimes from her balcony. They moved with heavy steps, their backs bent, their arms strong from endless toil. She envied them in a strange way, not for their suffering, but for the companionship they seemed to share. They laughed with one another, whispered to one another, even as the overseers barked commands. She, in her silks and pearls, felt more imprisoned than any of them. At least they belonged to one another. She belonged to no one but him. As time passed, her isolation deepened. The colonel was rarely tender. When he spoke to her, it was with authority, as if addressing a subordinate rather than a wife. When he touched her, it was with a possessiveness that made her shrink inside, though she never dared show it. Nights in the great bed became trials of silence. She longed for warmth, for affection, for some sign that he saw her as more than an extension of his pride. But those longings went unanswered, and slowly she folded them away inside her heart, burying them where even she could scarcely reach. Her family visited occasionally, and for those brief days she felt almost alive again. With them she could laugh, she could share little joys, but the colonel always hovered near, his watchful eyes making sure she never forgot her role. They praised her for her beauty, for the grandeur of her new home, and she smiled as if content. But when they left, the silence returned heavier than before, pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. In time, whispers about her unhappiness began to circulate among the slaves and servants. They saw her eyes, her pale complexion, the way she moved through the house like a ghost. Some pitied her, though they dared not speak it aloud. Others feared for her, sensing that the colonel's pride left little room for weakness. In a world where even a hint of defiance could invite punishment, She walked a narrow path, careful to keep her composure, careful never to betray her despair. She spent long hours in the gardens, where the air was heavy with magnolia and jasmine. There she found her only solace, among the roses and shaded trees. She read poetry in secret, wrote in a hidden journal, and sometimes allowed herself to cry where no one could see. Those tears were her rebellion, her proof that she was still human beneath the role she played. Yet even in those private moments, she felt the walls of the plantation closing around her, a gilded cage disguised as paradise. The marriage had become less a union than a performance. To the world, she was the radiant wife of a powerful man. To herself, she was little more than a silent figure trapped in his shadow. The weight of it pressed heavier each year, until she no longer remembered the girl she had been before. She was a wife in name, a possession in truth, her life dictated by a man whose pride cared nothing for her soul. And though she could not yet imagine the shocking pact that would come, she already felt the first cracks forming in the fragile edifice of the dynasty. The silence between them was not emptiness. It was the beginning of a fracture that would one day tear their world apart. The idea did not come to the colonel all at once. It crept into his mind gradually, like a shadow that lengthened with each passing day. His pride had always demanded spectacle, acts that would leave others speechless with either admiration or horror, but it was during a season of endless monotony on the plantation that the thought began to take root. The harvest was abundant, his wealth untouched, his reputation intact. He should have felt content, but instead he was restless. To a man like him, stability was not comfort, it was boredom, and boredom gnawed at him more viciously than any enemy ever could. He began to dwell on his wife, not with tenderness, but with the same possessive curiosity with which he had once regarded a prized horse or a valuable piece of land. She was beautiful, yes, but she was silent, subdued, a figure who obeyed without question. To most men, such a wife might have been considered a blessing. To the colonel, it was an opportunity. What better way to test his power than through her? What greater demonstration of control than to demand something of her that no other man in polite society would dare imagine? At first, the thought flickered only in his private reflections. He would sit in the library, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the fire casting shadows across the bookshelves, and the idea would whisper to him. He imagined her not as his untouchable possession, but as a pawn in a game only he could play. The rules of marriage, of morality, of decency, all of them were boundaries meant for lesser men. He believed, was above them. If he chose to break them, it was not sin but proof of his superiority. The pact began to take shape in the dark corners of his mind. 7 slaves, men he owned, men whose lives he controlled with a word, would be granted access to the one thing no man could touch without his permission, his wife. The act would not be about pleasure, it would be about power. It would be about showing that he could take what society held sacred and twist it to his will. His wife would submit because she belonged to him. The slaves would obey because they had no choice, and he, in orchestrating the unthinkable, would remind himself and everyone who whispered about his name that he was a man without equal. When the idea first crossed from thought to consideration, he tested it in small ways. He made comments to his overseer, veiled enough to be dismissed as jokes, about how a man might test his wife's loyalty. He spoke to his drinking companions in hushed tones, asking what a man's pride was truly worth if he could not gamble with the things most precious to him. His companions laughed uneasily, thinking him eccentric, but the colonel's eyes gleamed with the intensity of a man who was no longer joking. His wife, meanwhile, sensed the change in him before she understood it. His gaze lingered on her differently now, not with desire but with calculation, as if she were a chess piece he was considering moving. He grew more insistent that she remain obedient, more controlling in small, cruel ways. choosing her gowns, dictating her conversations, restricting her movements. She did not yet know what he planned, but she felt it, the storm building in silence. The colonel, for his part, relished the secrecy. He nurtured the thought like a hidden fire, feeding it with pride until it burned hot enough to demand action. To him, the risk was intoxicating. What if the pact destroyed his reputation? What if it shattered his marriage? The very possibility excited him, because it was in defying the unthinkable that he felt most alive. Men ruled their homes, their wives, their slaves, but no man ruled like he intended to. When the moment came to reveal his intentions, he did so with the same cold authority that defined his every command. One evening, after supper, he summoned his wife to the library. She entered quietly, her footsteps muffled against the thick rug, and stood before him with her hands folded nervously. He did not invite her to sit. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until she felt the weight of it. Then, in a voice as calm as it was terrifying, he told her what he intended. At first, she thought she had misunderstood. The words were too monstrous, too surreal to be real. Her heart pounded in her chest, her lips parted in disbelief, but when she saw his expression, serious, unflinching, resolved, she knew he meant every word. She tried to protest, to plead with him, but he silenced her with a glance that froze the words on her tongue. To resist him outright would mean humiliation, punishment, perhaps even violence, and in that moment she understood the full depth of her captivity. She was not a wife, she was not a partner, she was property, and he was about to prove it in the most brutal way imaginable. The colonel set the terms with precision, as though drawing up a contract. The 7 men would be chosen by him, summoned to the house under his orders, and made to participate. His wife would not speak of it to anyone, not even in whispers. The pact would remain between the walls of his estate, known only to those who were forced into it. And should she defy him, he promised consequences that would destroy not only her but her family as well. His power was absolute, and he wielded it without hesitation. That night, long after he dismissed her, she sat in her chamber with the door locked and her body trembling. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the pale, hollow-eyed woman staring back. She thought of escape, of running into the night, but where could she go? She had no money, no allies, no power. The world outside the plantation was not kind to women who defied their husbands, and the colonel's reach stretched further than she could ever run. She felt trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. And yet, in the darkest corners of her mind, a seed of defiance stirred. She could not stop the pact, she knew that, but she could endure it, she could survive it, and perhaps, if fortune allowed, she could find a way to make him regret the cruelty he had unleashed. For now, however, she was powerless, bound by his will, forced to submit to a fate that would forever mark her life and his dynasty. The pact was conceived in arrogance, born of pride and cruelty, but it was more than a moment of madness. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel everything the colonel had built. In seeking to prove his dominance, he had set in motion a destruction he could not yet imagine, a destruction that would leave his family's name in ruins and his dynasty in ashes. The night of the pact arrived without fanfare, without ceremony, but with a heaviness that hung over the great house like a suffocating fog. The colonel had prepared every detail with the same precision he devoted to his crops and accounts. He had chosen the 7 men himself, selecting not the weakest nor the strongest, but those whose obedience he could most trust, whose loyalty, or fear, ensured silence. Each was summoned under the pretense of a command, told to present themselves in the quarters near the main house when the bell struck. None dared question why. The slaves, hardened by years of submission, came silently, their expressions guarded, their minds uneasy. They had endured many cruelties under the colonel, but this command was unlike anything they had ever known. Rumors spread quickly among the quarters, whispers of something unspeakable about to unfold. But none of the chosen men could refuse. To disobey the colonel was to invite the lash, the noose, or worse. Inside the house, the wife waited, trembling. She sat in her chamber, her hands clenched so tightly the knuckles were white, her heart racing in her chest. She had tried to steel herself in the days leading up to this night, telling herself she could endure anything if she shut her mind away. But when the sounds of footsteps echoed in the hall, when the heavy door opened, the reality crushed her resolve. She rose instinctively like a prisoner hearing the approach of the guard, her body frozen between fear and disbelief. The colonel entered first, his face calm, his manner composed, as though nothing about this night was extraordinary. He surveyed her with cold satisfaction, then gestured for the men to be brought in. One by one they entered, their eyes lowered, their bodies tense. They avoided her gaze, ashamed, fearful, uncertain of what was to come. The room was thick with silence, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath their steps. The colonel spoke with the authority of a man declaring law. He laid out the terms, reminding them all that his command was not to be questioned. His words stripped the moment of any humanity, reducing it to an act of will, of domination. His wife was not addressed as a woman, not even as his spouse, but as if she were an object he had chosen to offer. He reminded the men that they lived and breathed at his mercy, that their silence afterward would be absolute, and that any disobedience would mean ruin. The cruelty of the pact was not only in the act itself, but in the way it twisted every soul present. The wife was reduced to a possession, the men to instruments of humiliation, and the colonel himself to a figure so consumed by pride that he mistook cruelty for strength. In that room, humanity dissolved into power and submission, dignity stripped away by command. For the wife, the hours that followed blurred into a nightmare from which she could not wake. She closed her eyes, tried to retreat into some corner of her mind untouched by the moment, but every sound, every touch, every command tore her further from herself. Her body remained, but her spirit felt shattered. She did not resist, she could not, but each breath burned with the knowledge that she had been forced into a role she had never chosen. The men, too, bore their own torment. Though compelled by fear, they knew that what they were commanded to do would stain them forever. Some moved stiffly, their shame palpable, while others obeyed with mechanical detachment, trying to separate their bodies from their souls. Not one of them dared to look at her directly, for to meet her eyes would have been to face their own guilt. When it was done, they left in silence, their steps heavy, their faces grim, each carrying a burden that no lash could match. The colonel alone appeared satisfied. He stood with arms folded, watching as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a performance staged for his amusement. His pride swelled, convinced that he had proved something. His control over his wife, his dominance over the men he owned, his ability to bend the world to his will. In his eyes, the night had been a triumph. In truth, it was the beginning of the end. For the wife, there was no triumph, only silence. In the days that followed, she moved through the house like a shadow, her face pale, her voice gone. She did not speak to him, did not weep, did not rage. Her silence was deeper than obedience. It was the silence of a soul retreating into itself. The servants noticed, whispering in corners about the change in her. The slaves carried their own secret, the weight of which pressed heavily on their hearts. Though bound by fear, they could not erase the memory of what they had been forced to do. The pact, once completed, could not be undone. It lingered in the house like a ghost, haunting every corridor, every glance. The wife carried it in her eyes, the slaves in their silence, and the colonel in his pride. He did not see the cracks forming, did not notice how the household's atmosphere shifted, how whispers began to ripple outward. He believed himself untouchable, but power built on cruelty does not remain unchallenged forever. That night marked the turning point. The great house still stood, the cotton still grew, the colonel still commanded, but the dynasty was no longer whole. Something irreparable had been broken within those walls, something that no wealth, no pride, no force could restore, and though the colonel would not admit it, though he would not even recognize it, the seeds of his downfall had been sown the moment he forced his will upon them all. The pact was no longer just an act of domination. It was a curse, and its shadow would stretch across every life it had touched, dragging the proudest dynasty into ruin. The pact had been carried out in silence, but silence on a plantation was never lasting. Rumors moved like wind, slipping between walls, whispering through kitchens, traveling across fields. No one could say how the story first began to spread, perhaps from a servant who heard muffled voices through a door, perhaps from one of the men who could not bear the weight of secrecy, perhaps from the strange, haunted look on the mistress's face as she drifted through the halls. Whatever the source, the whispers grew, and within weeks the air of the estate was heavy with suspicion. At first the colonel ignored it. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that fear alone would keep tongues tied. And to some extent it did. The slaves did not dare speak openly, but even whispers are dangerous when carried by dozens of ears. The overseers, accustomed to discipline and silence, began to notice the strange way the men chosen for the pact avoided their mistress, the way their eyes dropped lower, their movements stiffer. In a world where everything was scrutinized, these small changes were enough to ignite speculation. The wife's demeanor only added fuel to the rumors. Once praised for her poise, she now walked the house like a ghost. Her eyes no longer shone, her steps carried no grace, her voice was rarely heard. When guests came, she sat quietly beside the colonel, offering the faintest smile when prompted, but her silence was too deep to go unnoticed. Women visiting the plantation whispered about her fragility, about how she seemed less a wife and more a prisoner. Men, emboldened by brandy, speculated cruelly about what secrets lay behind her hollow gaze. The colonel, however, reveled in his own private triumph. He mistook her silence for submission, her pallor for proof of his control. To him, the whispers that floated through the quarters and parlors were nothing more than gossip, easily dismissed. He assured himself that no one would dare accuse him openly, for his wealth and his name carried too much weight. What he did not understand was that a dynasty is built as much on perception as on wealth, and perception is far more fragile. Slowly, cracks began to appear in the house of pride he had constructed. Trusted allies grew distant, their visits less frequent, their conversations shorter. The overseers, though still obedient, cast him sidelong glances when they thought he would not notice. Even his slaves, bound by chains of fear, carried an air of quiet defiance, as if the knowledge of what he had forced upon them had given them some unseen power. They knew his secret, and though they could not wield it openly, the weight of it shifted the balance of power in small, subtle ways. Beyond the plantation, whispers traveled further than he imagined. A cousin who visited for supper carried a story to town. A guest who had lingered too long in the hallway brought back suspicions to his circle of friends. The rumors took shape like smoke, impossible to hold yet impossible to ignore. People began to ask questions, not openly, but in careful, measured tones. Why did the colonel's wife appear so withdrawn? Why did she avoid the eyes of her husband's slaves? Why had the colonel grown more restless, more short-tempered, more eager to flaunt his authority than ever before? The dynasty's foundation was perception, strength, respect, dominance. But perception is a delicate mask, and once it cracks, it can never be fully repaired. The colonel's pride, once admired, now seemed like arrogance. His discipline, once praised, now whispered of cruelty. And the story of the pact, though never spoken in public halls, began to hang over his name like a shadow that grew longer with every retelling. For his wife, each passing day was another descent into despair. She endured her role silently, but the silence was no longer submission, it was survival. She knew the world outside would not protect her, that society would blame her rather than him. but she also knew that silence could become its own weapon. The more she withdrew, the more others noticed. Without speaking a word, she turned herself into living proof of the cruelty she endured. Every pale cheek, every haunted glance, every trembling hand testified to what had been done, and in a society obsessed with appearances, such testimony carried weight. The men forced into the pact bore their own scars. They returned to the fields, to their labor, to their chains, but they were not the same. Some carried shame, some rage, some a quiet hatred that simmered beneath the surface. Though bound to obedience, they carried knowledge that gave them a strange sense of power. They had seen the colonel's cruelty, not just as slaves, but as witnesses to his corruption, and that knowledge bound them together in a silence that was not submission but defiance. The great house still shone in the sunlight, its columns gleaming, its gardens immaculate, but within its walls the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. What had once been a symbol of dominance was now a tomb of secrets. Every creak of the floor, every whisper in the hall, every stolen glance carried the weight of the pact. The dynasty was beginning to unravel, not in a sudden collapse, but in the slow, inevitable erosion of trust, respect, and loyalty. The colonel, blind in his pride, refused to see it. He strutted through his estate, convinced that his authority remained absolute, that his wife was subdued, that his slaves were silenced. He mistook fear for respect, silence for loyalty, obedience for submission. What he failed to understand was that fear festers into hatred, silence grows into whispers, and obedience breeds rebellion. The pact had not strengthened his control, it had poisoned it. And so, as the days turned into months, the dynasty that had seemed unshakable began to tremble. The fields still yielded cotton, the accounts still swelled with profit, but beneath the surface, the house of pride was rotting. The whispers grew louder, the stares longer, the silence heavier. The pact, once a private demonstration of his dominance, had become a curse spreading through every corner of his world. And though he could not yet see it, the dynasty he had built with iron hands and ruthless pride was already beginning to break. The ruin of a dynasty does not come all at once. It begins in whispers, in glances, in the quiet turning of allies into skeptics, of silence into suspicion. For the colonel, the slow erosion of his power passed unnoticed until it could no longer be ignored. He had always ruled through pride, through fear, through the sheer force of his will, but pride has a way of blinding a man to the dangers gathering in the shadows. It began with small acts of defiance. A servant who once hurried now moved a little slower. An overseer, long loyal, allowed the slightest hesitation in carrying out an order. The chosen slaves, those 7 men whose lives had been twisted by the pact, carried themselves with a subtle shift, a quiet dignity born not of pride but of endurance. They no longer looked at the colonel with the same trembling fear. They did not need to speak. Their silence was rebellion enough. The wife, too, had changed. Though still silent, her silence was no longer submission. It was a shield, a refusal to grant him the satisfaction of her words. She no longer tried to smile in front of guests, no longer played the role of radiant hostess. Instead, she carried her grief openly, her pale face and hollow eyes bearing witness to the cruelty she endured. Her defiance was not loud, but it was powerful. Each time she sat in silence at his side, the guests around the table saw not a loyal wife, but a broken one, and they wondered what had broken her. The colonel's temper grew shorter with each passing day. He felt the shift, though he could not name it, and it gnawed at him like a rat chewing through the beams of his great house. He raged at the overseers for minor mistakes, lashed out at his slaves with renewed cruelty, and drank more heavily than before. His pride, once a mask of strength, now revealed itself as desperation. He felt his grip loosening, and in his desperation he clutched harder, blind to the fact that the harder a man squeezes, the quicker the sand slips through his fingers. The breaking point came not from within the house, but from beyond its walls, rumors, once contained to the plantation, began to seep outward into town. They were never spoken in the open. No one dared accuse him directly, but they spread in whispers through parlors, across church pews, in the quiet corners of taverns. People spoke of his wife's silence, of her haunted look, of the strange behavior of the men in his fields. The whispers carried a darker speculation, a story too monstrous to be believed, yet too persistent to be dismissed. Reputation was everything in that society, and the colonel's reputation began to falter. Men who once courted his favor grew cautious. Invitations dwindled. His family's name, once spoken with admiration, was now mentioned with unease. The very thing he had sought to prove, his superiority, was unraveling, not through public accusation, but through private judgment. He became a man avoided, his grandeur a mask no longer convincing. The slaves, sensing the shift, began to hold their heads higher. Though still bound by chains, they carried within them a knowledge that no lash could erase. The knowledge that the master who claimed absolute power had revealed his weakness. They had been forced into his pact, yet in surviving it, they had gained something he could never take from them, proof of his corruption, of his cruelty, of his humanity stripped bare. They saw the cracks in his armor, and though they did not yet act, the seed of rebellion took root. The wife, too, found a quiet strength in her suffering. She no longer wept in secret, the tears had dried. Instead, she endured with a resolve that startled even herself. She knew she was trapped, that escape was impossible, but she also knew that his dynasty was crumbling around him. Each whisper in town, each glance at supper, each faltering of his once commanding presence was her silent revenge. He had tried to destroy her spirit, but in doing so, he had destroyed his own legacy. Then came the night of violence, the moment when pride turned to blood. The colonel, drunk and enraged by another day of subtle defiance, summoned one of the 7 men from the quarters. His command was sharp, his anger spilling out in every word. The man obeyed, but when he entered the room, something in his posture was different. He no longer cowered. He stood tall, silent, his eyes meeting the colonel's with a calm that was more dangerous than defiance. For a moment the balance shifted, and the colonel saw himself reflected not as master but as tyrant. The confrontation ended in blood. The details were murky. Whether the slave struck first or the colonel lashed out in drunken fury, no one could say. But by dawn the plantation buzzed with the story. A man lay beaten half, dead in the quarters, and the colonel's hands bore the marks of his violence. The whispers spread faster than ever, fueled by fear and fascination. The pact, once a hidden curse, had now birthed open violence, and the dynasty could no longer pretend to stand untarnished. From that night onward, the house was no longer the same. The slaves moved with a simmering tension, the overseers carried their duties with unease, and the wife withdrew into a silence so deep it felt like mourning. The colonel raged louder, but his rage only revealed his weakness. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and though the great house still gleamed in the sun, it now stood as a monument to a dynasty unraveling. Blood and betrayal had entered its walls, and from that moment forward, the destruction of the colonel's name was inevitable. The end of the colonel's dynasty came not with a thunderclap, not with a grand trial or a public disgrace, but with the slow, suffocating collapse of everything he had built. For a man who had defined himself by power, by control, by the illusion of mastery, there was no crueler punishment than watching it all dissolve in silence. The great house still stood, but it had become hollow, its walls echoing with the ghost of what once was. The violence of that night lingered like smoke that refused to clear. The slave who had suffered beneath the colonel's rage never fully recovered, though he lived on as a broken figure, a reminder etched into flesh of the master's cruelty. The others carried his wounds as their own, a symbol of what bound them together. The pact that had once chained them in humiliation now chained the colonel in shame, for every glance, every silent nod between the 7 was a reminder of his sin. He could lash them, starve them, rage at them, but he could not erase what they knew. In the town, the whispers sharpened into something closer to belief. They no longer speculated in vague murmurs, now they spoke in knowing tones, piecing together fragments of truth. The colonel's wife, pale and silent, became the centerpiece of their rumors. Some pitied her, others judged her, but all agreed she was a woman marked by tragedy. The colonel's name was still spoken with respect in some quarters, but it was the brittle respect born of fear, not admiration. His invitations were declined more often than accepted, his company avoided at church and market. He had become a man apart, standing in the shadow of his own ruin. Inside the household, the wife's silence deepened into something almost regal. She no longer bowed her head in shame, but carried herself with a dignity that unsettled her husband. Though she had been broken, she refused to let him see her as less than whole. Her silence was no longer submission. It was judgment, constant and unyielding. Each time she sat across from him at the dinner table, she seemed less his possession and more his accuser, her eyes hollow yet sharp, cutting him more deeply than any words could. The slaves, too, had transformed. They did not rise up in rebellion, for they knew the cost of such defiance, but they carried themselves with an unspoken bond. They had endured the unendurable together, and in that endurance they found strength. Each day they worked the fields, each night they returned to their quarters, and though their lives were still bound in chains, they knew something their master did not. His dynasty was already dead. He could not command their fear as he once had. He could not erase the truth etched into their memories, and in that truth lay their quiet victory. The colonel himself aged faster than nature intended. His hair grayed, his shoulders stooped, and his face bore the deep lines of bitterness. He drank more heavily, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Nights found him pacing the halls of the great house, muttering to himself, haunted by phantoms of the past. He saw in every glance of his wife, in every bowed head of his slaves, an accusation. He had sought to prove his power, but all he had proven was his weakness. The pride that once sustained him now consumed him from within, leaving only a hollow shell of the man he had been. The final blow came quietly, almost unnoticed, in the form of abandonment. His allies withdrew, his overseers sought employment elsewhere, and even his relatives distanced themselves, unwilling to tie their fortunes to a man whose name had become tainted. When he died, it was not in a blaze of glory or the respect of his peers, but in solitude, surrounded only by walls that remembered too much. The dynasty he had sought to preserve ended with him, his name fading into obscurity, spoken only in whispers of cautionary tales. His wife lived on, not in happiness but in endurance. She carried her silence to the grave, her dignity intact even in suffering. The slaves, too, lived on, passing their stories from one generation to the next. They did not record them in books, but in the quiet oral traditions that carried memory forward, ensuring that the truth, though hidden from polite society, would not be forgotten. And so the colonel's pact, the decision that he believed would affirm his power, became the very thing that destroyed him. His dynasty ended not because of rebellion or revolution, but because of pride, cruelty, and the corruption of his own soul. His story lingered not as a testament to greatness, but as a warning of how quickly power can turn to ruin when wielded without humanity. In the end, his house stood empty, a decaying monument to arrogance. The fields grew wild, the walls crumbled, and the land bore silent witness to the cost of one man's hubris. His name was lost to history, but the memory of what he had done lived on in the whispers of those who survived him, in the scars borne by their children, and in the unyielding truth that no dynasty built on cruelty can endure. The colonel had given his wife to 7 slaves in a twisted attempt to assert his dominance, but in doing so, he had written the epitaph of his own family. The agreement that destroyed a dynasty in America ended not with triumph, but with silence. The silence of a wife, the silence of enslaved men, and finally, the silence of a ruined legacy.